Hello and welcome to A Genteel Black Hole, the home of my bookish rambles. My name's Ali, and this is the Shakespeare Journey Tag. So, Shaketember is upon us. This is a month-long celebration of the works of Shakespeare on Booktube, and it's led by Kelly from Books I'm Not Reading, Jason from Old Blues Chapter and Verse, and Nicole from A Day of Small Things. I'll link to all of their channels in the description. I believe they're all hosting read-alongs of their chosen Shakespeare plays. There's Twelfth Night, there's The Tempest, there's Titus Andronicus, there's Cymbeline. I've never read Cymbeline. I'm kind of interested in trying that out if I have the energy and the time for it. And they've also created this book tag, this questionnaire all about Shakespeare, which I thought I would give my answers to celebrate Shaketember. So the first question is, what was your first experience reading Shakespeare, and what was it like? Well, my first experience of reading Shakespeare would have been in school, as I'm sure it was for a lot of people. I had seen some Shakespeare before that. My parents were keen theatre goers, especially my mum, and I was taken to several Shakespeare plays before we ever studied him in school. I remember seeing Romeo and Juliet, Twelfth Night, A Midsummer Night's Dream. Saw a few different versions of A Midsummer Night's Dream. But my first time reading Shakespeare, I can't remember which way around it was. I'm pretty sure we read Romeo and Juliet first and then Macbeth. So I guess, yes, it must have been Romeo and Juliet was my first experience. And that was obviously reading it in the classroom with all my classmates taking turns at reading the lines in a very kind of uncertain and stilted, sometimes confused and often very unenthusiastic way, which I have to say is not the best way to experience Shakespeare. And the other thing about studying it in school, especially before you reach like higher education, is that there's a lot of there's a lot of innuendo in Shakespeare. There's a lot of like outright filth, honestly, in a wonderful way. I love it. But a lot of that will be glossed over by teachers because it's a very awkward conversation to have with a class of 15-year-olds who, I mean, to be fair, that would probably actually make them engage with it more. But I think most teachers, certainly all of the teachers in my life, very much kind of glossed over all of that sort of stuff, which kind of feels like you're missing quite a lot of what Shakespeare has to offer. Because I think his plays, they're never just one thing. They're never one tone, never one style all the way through. The tragedies always have some humor in them. The comedies always have a little bit of pathos, a bit of sadness in them. And I think that if you gloss over the comedy and the innuendo, the sexuality in the plays, you're missing a lot. And so, yeah, I don't recommend reading Shakespeare in the class. Well, obviously I recommend it in terms of I think it should be done, but I don't think it's the best way of experiencing Shakespeare. I'll probably cut some of the end of that. That got away from me a bit. Anyway, question 2. Has the reading of a Shakespeare play ever brought you to tears? What scene was it, and where were you when it happened? I think that I think that the times that Shakespeare has brought me to tears has been watching the plays rather than reading them. But having said that, there are a few moments that I do remember, like welling up when I read it. But those were plays that I'd already seen versions of. I tend to watch them first and then read them. So I already had that emotional connection, and I suppose reading it on the page was almost kind of bringing back memories of the play, and the emotional connection I felt to a particular performance, rather than necessarily just the words on the page. So, for example, the scene in Hamlet, Ophelia's breakdown scene, which is one of the most harrowing things that I've seen performed on a stage. The line, "I would give you some violets, but they withered all when my father died." That, I mean, even saying the words has kind of brought a lump to my throat. It's one of the most concise expressions of grief and loss that I think I've ever read. And yes, even reading it on the page makes me well up, but seeing it performed had an even greater effect. But the other thing that often gets me is the scene in Much Ado About Nothing, where Benedict and Beatrice, after the disastrous wedding, well, not wedding, I suppose, when they finally confess their secret love for each other, the line, I think, I do love nothing in the world so well as you. Is not that strange? And then later in that scene, the I love you with so much of my heart that none is left to protest. Those bits also, in a much nicer way, I suppose they make me well up as well. And also, speaking of Much Ado About Nothing, Beatrice's line after someone has said, "You were born in a merry hour," and she says, "No, sure, my lord, my mother cried. But then there was a star danced, and under that was I born." Yeah, I can't explain why that gets me, but it does. Question 3 is, are there any people that have played a significant role in your Shakespeare journey? And I would say first and foremost would be my mum. As I mentioned earlier, my parents have both been big theatre goers, especially mum. And when I was in my early teens, maybe pre-teens, they were big fans of Barry Rutter's Northern Broadsides theatre company. My parents are Scottish, and so this theatre company that were all from the north of England, although it's not Scotland, it appealed to them more, just the kind of hearing it in regional accents instead of the sort of plummy received pronunciation that I think most people, if they're doing a stereotypical impression of Shakespeare, that's what they do. It's to be or not to be. That is the question. And Northern Broadsides don't do that. It would be to be or not to be. That's the question. That was a terrible accent. I apologise. So I got taken to a lot of their productions in my youth. I also was fortunate enough to see Propeller, an all-male group, doing A Midsummer Night's Dream at the Watermill Theatre in Newbury when I was about 15 or so, and that I think was probably the most I'd enjoyed a Shakespeare play up to that point, and for a while afterwards. And I suppose another significant figure in my Shakespeare journey would have to be David Tennant. Now, as I think I've mentioned before in my videos, I'm a massive Whovian. I have been since the revival series started in 2005. So from that first Christopher Eccleston series, I was in. But yeah, because of Doctor Who, I became a fan of David Tennant's work in general. It was seeing David Tennant's TV movie version of Hamlet with Patrick Stewart as Claudius and the ghost of Hamlet's father. I saw that I think it was produced in like 2009, so it was right around when he was doing his last series of Doctor Who. But for some reason, I didn't watch it at the time. I only saw it like years later. I think I saw it in 2015, eventually. And watching that, I'd never seen or read Hamlet before then. And so watching that really made Shakespeare click for me. I can divide my life, if you will, into like pre-Hamlet and post-Hamlet. There's a few things in my life that have had such a massive effect on me and led me down like paths of fandom that I never would have envisioned. And seeing David Tennant's Hamlet that triggered like a major fandom moment. And from then on, I started seeking out all the Shakespeare I could find, seeking out DVDs of good film versions and filmed stage versions, and eventually started reading them as well. And even started acting in a few amateur productions. So, I think I've got to give David Tennant a lot of credit, because without that, I'm not sure I would have ever, taken evening classes for acting and gone on the stage as an actor rather than a musician. So, yeah, that was a pretty significant one for me. Question 4 is, do you have a favourite book or film about Shakespeare? And I think probably my favourite book about Shakespeare is This is Shakespeare by Emma Smith. And that is a series of essays, I think originally delivered as lectures, about each chapter, each essay lecture is focusing on a different play of Shakespeare's through a different academic lens. But I think Emma Smith's main kind of hypothesis, I suppose you could call it, her explanation for why Shakespeare has remained so popular after 400 years, so popular, so widely performed and studied, is a quality that his plays possess, which she describes as gappiness. And that is simply the fact that there is so much information not written down on the page, but that has to be deduced or decided by the reader, the director, the actor, the production team. A lot of modern stage plays, if you read them on the page, they will have like copious notes about like what the stage looks like, what the set looks like, where the actors should be on the stage, all of that, how certain lines should be performed, whether they're whispered or bellowed, or if they're fearful, or, anything that might not be like obviously on the page just from reading the dialogue. They put it in, and I mean, naturally that makes sense. It makes it easier to read. It makes it easier to put on a production, and I think playwrights nowadays are probably more kind of precious about how their plays are produced and performed. Shakespeare, his plays have so few stage directions. It's exit, it's enter, it's they kiss, they fight, he dies, is pretty much all you get for like most of the plays. If something really notable happens that can't be kind of clued in the dialogue, such as the famous stage direction from The Winter's Tale, exit pursued by a bear. But he doesn't tell you, he doesn't dictate how the lines are read. He doesn't dictate what's happening, often like where it's happening. You have to work this out from context clues, which can make reading the plays kind of tricky at first, which is why I recommend like watching a version before you read it, because a lot of that work is then kind of done for you by the actors and the director. But then when you read it, you can interpret it your own way if you wish. And he also doesn't dictate how you should feel about a character. There are some obvious villains in his work, but there's a lot of room for interpretation. For example, I would read Romeo and Juliet. For me, the tragedy is the fact that they loved each other, and were it not for the fact that their families were at war, they could have had a loving, long, happy relationship where nobody needed to die. I have read other arguments where people describe Romeo as the villain of the play, and like say that he's an older boy taking advantage of young Juliet. I would say nowhere in the play does it specify exactly what age Romeo is. Juliet's age is specified, and maybe Romeo is a couple of years older than her, which I know at that young age every year does make some difference, but I don't think he's like 18 or anything like that, as some people seem to be claiming. But this is their interpretation. It's not stated in the text definitively what age Romeo is. So what age you interpret him to be will necessarily change your view of the play and of him as a character. It's all that kind of, as Emma Smith says in her book, gappiness. Shakespeare very rarely has like a moral, a definitive, obvious moral in his plays. I would say that one of the only ones that actually does spell it out for you is Romeo and Juliet, with the prologue. But generally the plays, they have so much room for interpretation based on how you read them, how the actors perform them, what the set is like, what the costumes are like, and it means that every production can be totally new and different and fresh. And in 400 years, people still keep coming back to it because it doesn't say the same thing to the same person every time. And yeah, I think Emma Smith's book, This is Shakespeare, is a really good discussion of that phenomenon, a really interesting analysis of the various plays. I particularly like the chapter about Twelfth Night and the inherent queerness of Twelfth Night. Being queer myself, that particularly appeals to me. But every chapter is interesting, even the chapters on plays that I haven't necessarily seen or read yet. But yeah, I highly recommend This is Shakespeare by Emma Smith. Question 5 is, which character in Shakespeare most resembles you, and in what ways? I could be flippant and say Falstaff, but I don't really know. I don't think I've ever kind of latched on to any one character as being like a perfect analogue for myself. I think that the strength of Shakespeare isn't necessarily that any one character is like fully relatable to one person. I'm sure there are people who like fully relate to one character or another, but I don't. But I think that the way he expresses the full gamut of human emotion spread throughout all of the characters in his work is what makes me connect with him and with them. I suppose one character that I have most related to for the way he speaks about grief and depression is Hamlet. I lost my mum to cancer in 2020, and I reread Hamlet not long after as a coping mechanism, because so much of the play is about grief, about the different ways that people cope with it. Hamlet and Ophelia both lose their fathers, and Laertes as well. And they all react in completely different but completely plausible ways. And none of them manage to avoid the tragedy of loss and grief and the inherent madness of it. But something about reading that actually I found it oddly reassuring. And there's a line that I can't remember now whether it's Claudius or Gertrude who says it. I think it might be Claudius. But in the context of the play, it's kind of presented as sort of a platitude, it's a bit hollow, a bit empty, but the words are so beautiful, and I do actually agree with them, despite the context that they're spoken in. Again, I might be misquoting. I think it's, "Thou knows 'tis common, all that lives must die, passing through nature to eternity." And I find that a really beautiful way of putting it, and also, I suppose, kind of a secular way as well. It doesn't feel rooted in any one religion or belief, and Given that I'm not religious myself, that's one thing that I kind of latched onto. That line really is really beautiful. But yes, I think Hamlet is one of the most relatable characters. This is partly because he just says the most out of any Shakespeare character. So you get to know the workings of his mind more than anyone else in the canon. But there's so many lines that just encapsulate feelings that I've had. I mean, what's that line? I could be bounded in a nutshell and consider myself a king of infinite space, were it not that I have bad dreams. Yeah. Relatable, Hamlet. Question 6. Which play would you most like to see performed in a theatre, and why? Well, I'm quite fortunate to have seen quite a few plays performed in a theatre. I live in the UK. It's not hard to get to Stratford from where I am. It's not hard to get to Oxford City, which has quite a few theatres. It's not hard to get to London. I mean, it takes a while, and the traffic is awful, but I can get there. So I have access, or at least kind of pre-COVID and pre my ongoing health shit, I did have easy access to plenty of theatres. So most of the plays that I really would want to see, I have already seen on stage. I've seen Hamlet. I saw the RSC production with Papa Isidu, which was absolutely stunning. I wept during it. Just an incredible production, incredible performance. And if you can find the Blu-ray, the DVD of that production, or find it streaming, I highly recommend it. Just stunning play. I was also lucky enough to see, I've seen a few productions of Twelfth Night. I think Twelfth Night might be the play I've seen most productions of. But my favourite one that I saw was, I think it was 2017 or around then. And it was a National Theatre production with Tamsin Gregg as a gender-swapped Malvolia. That was truly excellent, absolutely hilarious. The whole cast were brilliant. I loved the staging. It was done in a sort of 1960s kind of mod fashions. Yeah, that was great. I've seen several versions of A Midsummer Night's Dream, but I think probably one play that I would really love to see in a theatre, and I haven't, would be Much Ado About Nothing. I've seen several filmed stage productions, and Ken Branagh's film, but the only time I've seen it in a theatre, I didn't really get to see it because I was acting in it in an amateur production. It was actually my first amateur production outside of like school plays. So I can't really say I've seen Much Ado About Nothing in the theatre because I was too busy being in Much Ado About Nothing in the theatre, or actually in a garden, or in a church nearby when it rained a few times. But yeah, I would really love to see Much Ado About Nothing live in the theatre. I'd like to see anything live in the theatre, honestly, because I haven't been to a theatre or a gig since 2020, and I really miss it. Question 7. What actor throughout history would you most like to have seen play Hamlet while in his prime? That's a tricky question because I feel like having seen both David Tennant and Papa Isidu perform Hamlet, and though both of those performances were so incredible in distinct and unique ways, that I have trouble really thinking who else I really wish I could see play Hamlet. I more would love to see David Tennant play more Shakespeare roles. I believe he's playing Macbeth on stage at the moment, or has been recently. And I don't know if that was filmed. I hope it was, because I would love to see that. I'd especially love to see him do more Shakespeare in his own accent. I assume he did the Scottish play in his accent. It'd be a weird choice if he didn't. But yeah, I would love to see that. But in terms of other actors that I would love to see having played Hamlet, I suppose one of my favourite screen actors certainly is Philip Seymour Hoffman. And I don't know if he did any Shakespeare that's available to watch. I'm sure he must have done some, but I think his vulnerability on screen could have made for a really, really compelling performance of Hamlet. Yeah, I can't think of anyone else. That's my main pick, Philip Seymour Hoffman for Hamlet. But yeah, I would need a time machine, unfortunately. Question 8 is deliver your favourite speech or soliloquy from a Shakespeare play. And I'm going to do what Kelly did in her version of this video, which is save that for the end. So, question 9, do any of Shakespeare's plays intimidate you? If yes, what play and why? I don't know if intimidate is the right word. I think possibly if I'd been thinking more academically before I watched Hamlet, rather than just going in expecting a sad play with David Tennant in it, I might have been intimidated by that because it has such a huge reputation. You know, it's considered probably the greatest work in the English language, like not just play but work of anything, and it might be. I think it probably does deserve that accolade, which, considering my kind of contrarian nature, the fact that I agree on that certainly says something. So I think maybe Hamlet could have intimidated me had I not had that weigh in. I don't know if intimidate is the right word. There are plays that I haven't seen or read, and when I look at them, I kind of think, oh, am I going to enjoy that? Am I going to get it? Especially, like, I don't really know anything about Cymbeline. I know that I think it's Nicole from A Day of Small Things is doing a read-along of Cymbeline this year for Shaketember. I would like to try and read it. I've also got a DVD of it, which I haven't watched, so maybe I'll watch it first and then read it, or maybe try and do it the other way around for a little change. But I'm slightly daunted by that, but I think it's just because I don't know anything about it yet, and one of the biggest challenges when reading Shakespeare, as I've mentioned before, just the lack of stage directions and having to do a lot of detective work with context clues. It slows you down a lot when reading, unless you're already familiar with the play through having seen it. So maybe I'll try and see it. And I suppose the other one that comes to mind is Troilus and Cressida, when I was first getting into Shakespeare in a major way, the what I'll call my post Hamlet years, I watched an acting workshop led by John Barton, who founded the Royal Shakespeare Company. It's a workshop series called Playing Shakespeare. I think you can find it all on YouTube. I got the DVD as well. But John Barton describes Troilus and Cressida as his favourite Shakespeare play. And he uses several scenes from it to kind of illustrate points and do exercises in this workshop thing. And I think because I'm not like super familiar with Greek mythology, so I feel like there's going to be a lot of stuff in Troilus and Cressida that I don't really have a kind of strong background in. So I feel like reading that or watching it is going to be a little bit tricky. But I intend to give it a go at some point. I've got a paperback copy of it, but I haven't got around to it yet, which I suppose would indicate that, yes, I do find it intimidating. Question 10. What tips would you give to intimidated readers coming to Shakespeare for the first time? And I think I would say maybe try not being a reader first. I've already said this in earlier questions, but I think that watching a production of it is the best way to get introduced to a play. You might not understand every word or every reference or allusion in the play when you first watch it or read it, but if you watch a production by actors who understand the words they're saying and can put the meaning across to you, if you can watch them perform it and get a sense of what's happening, who the characters are, what the play is about, that helps so much before you actually go and read every word on the page and pick apart every line and analyze it and look at the footnotes and read the essays about it and all of that stuff. Basically, don't approach it academically before you've approached it just as a fan, as someone who wants to have a good time at the theatre or watching a movie. Because at the end of the day, I don't want to say at the end of the day in this video, I'm going to recut that. Because the most important thing is that you enjoy the play, first and foremost. You want to get swept up in the events, the characters. You want to feel something. And I think that's a lot easier to do that if you're watching a production of it. If you're watching actors putting on a great performance, or even, honestly, a middling performance can be enough. Go to, if there are amateur productions near you, go to one of those. You might not have high expectations because it's an amateur production, but I've seen some fantastic amateur productions. I've had a better time at some amateur productions than I have at some professional ones. And I think that, they are plays, and plays are meant to be performed and enjoyed communally with an audience. Or if, like me, you can't get to the theatre right now, at least watched on a screen, performed live, or a film version, whichever. But yeah, I think that knowing the play before you try and read it is the best advice I can give. Another useful thing would be get an annotated version of the plays. Don't just try and read like the plain text, because there's going to be a lot of words that you don't know, a lot of allusions to Greek and Roman mythology and folklore and all of this sort of stuff that I certainly needed a helping hand with that. I need to be told in the footnotes what Diana's orb is. It's the moon. So yeah, get a version with footnotes. If you can go to a bookshop and they have like multiple versions, multiple printings of the same play, have a little flick through each one, see which printing is easiest on your eyes. I really like the RSC paperbacks, but I know other people will prefer like Oxford University Press or Arden or Folger or whatever. So yeah, try some different printings. Use the footnotes, but also try not to if you can possibly avoid it, because it does slow your reading down. And especially with a play, you kind of want to get swept up in the action, which is a lot harder if you're like pausing every line to go, oh, what does that mean again? Oh yeah, that's exactly what I thought it meant. You know, only look at the footnotes if you're completely baffled. And later you can go back and do like a full line by line reading and try and get as much out of it as you can. But yeah, I think don't put too much pressure on yourself to understand everything all at once, because people have been studying these plays for 400 years now, and there's a lot to find, a lot to study, a lot of different lenses to look at them through, and you're not going to get everything there is to get from one reading, or two, three, however many. There's always something a bit more, which maybe sounds kind of intimidating at first, a little bit scary, but it's also a gift, because if you fall in love with these plays, then the ability to go back to them and keep finding new things is just wonderful. So if you are intimidated, I hope that you will give it a go. But yes, I would recommend watching before you read, because that will just give you a lot easier access to what's on the page. Question 11 is, which is your favourite Shakespeare play and why? I think it's probably clear from what I've been saying so far that Hamlet is, I think, probably my favourite. Aside from that, I would also say Twelfth Night and Much Ado About Nothing are both very high up on the list. I think Twelfth Night just pips it. But yes, I would say Hamlet and Twelfth Night, which interestingly I think were written about the same time. And I think both in different forms have a lot to say about grief. But Twelfth Night is also really very funny and super queer. So that's a good time. Question 12 is tag other booktubers. Now, I think this tag was published last year, and so I am not sure which booktubers have done it or not. So I'm going to leave it open and say, if you have a channel and you want to do this tag and you haven't already, then go ahead, consider yourself tagged. Or if you have done it and your answers have changed, hey, do it again. And again, consider yourself tagged. So, coming back to question 8, deliver your favourite speech or soliloquy from a Shakespeare play. And I'm going to do one that is from a play I haven't talked about yet, and that is Richard II. That's another one that I first saw through David Tennant's performance. He did it with the Royal Shakespeare Company, and it was filmed live on stage. I got the box set of, they did like a season of history plays and released a box set of the whole thing called King and Country. And yeah, Richard II is quite a complex play, especially like if, like me, you're not super up on like the history of the period that it's set in, and especially like history of monarchs. That usually bores me to tears, honestly. Much more interested in like social history, history of like ordinary working class people. I find that much more interesting than like kings and queens. But if Shakespeare is writing about kings and queens, then I'm into it. So Richard II is a play about Richard II, funnily enough, and how he is eventually deposed by his cousin Henry Bolingbroke, aka Henry IV, as he becomes at the end of the play. There's a scene where Richard kind of starts to panic as he realizes that he's losing support and realizes how tenuous his grasp on the crown is becoming. And throughout most of the play, he refers to himself with the royal we, because at that time they believed, I don't know, maybe the royal family still does believe this, but certainly at the time it was believed that the king had two bodies, essentially, his own human mortal body and the kind of the immortal body of like the king as a position, as it were. And so gradually, as Richard loses support and is eventually deposed, one of the interesting things is that he stops referring to himself as we and starts becoming I. That essentially he has to stop being the king in order to become a human being. Yeah, his speech is one that I memorized. I hope I'll get it exactly right, but I'm not going to refer back to it. I'm not going to have it on the page. So if I get it wrong, it's because I forgot a line. But this speech has a special place in my heart, partly because I used it as an audition speech and got part in The Winter's Tale back in 2017. So yeah, I'm not saying I'm going to put on as good a performance as I did in the audition room, but I do love this speech. For God's sake, let us sit upon the ground and tell sad stories of the death of kings. How some have been deposed, some slain in war, some haunted by the ghosts they have deposed, some poisoned by their wives, some sleeping killed, all murdered. For within the hollow crown, which rounds the mortal temples of a king, keeps death his court. And there the antic sits, scoffing his state and grinning at his pomp, allowing him a breath, a little scene to monarchize, be feared, and kill with looks, infusing him with self and vain conceit, as if this flesh which walls about our life were brass, impregnable, and humoured thus, comes at the last, and with a little pin bores through his castle walls. And farewell, king. Cover your heads. Mock not flesh and blood with solemn reverence. Throw away tradition, form, and ceremonious duty. For you have but mistook me all this while. I live with bread, like you. Feel want. Taste grief. Need friends. Subjected thus, how can you say to me, I am a king? So that's my Shaketember Shakespeare Journey Tag. Thanks to Kelly and Jason and Nicole for running Shaketember, and for Kelly in particular for pointing out this tag to me. So let me know in the comments, what's your favourite Shakespeare play? And which actor do you want to see play Hamlet? I'll be back with another video whenever, but until then, I hope you have a lovely day, and I will see you when I see you.